Center for the Study of World Religions, Harvard Divinity School.
So good evening and welcome. My name is Charles Stang. I serve as the director here at the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard Divinity School. And I want to thank you for coming out this evening, and I want to give a special word of welcome to our guests online. I hear we have nearly 200 people joining us online, a testament to Professor Buell's great popularity. So as part of the Center's new Transcendentalism initiative, we are honored to host Professor Larry Buell and to celebrate the publication of his latest book. Pardon me one second. Right here. Henry David Thoreau, Thinking Disobediently, and copies of which are available for sale in our lobby. While no single event can fully encompass the breadth and influence of Professor Buell's scholarship, this small occasion offers an opportunity to honor his many contributions to the study of Transcendentalism and to American literary and cultural history more broadly. A brief word about Professor Buell. He is the Powell M. Cabot Professor of American Literature Emeritus here at Harvard University. Some of his previous books include Literary Transcendentalism, 1973, The Environmental Imagination, 1995, a book on Emerson in 2003, and most recently, this book on Henry David Thoreau. Among other prizes and awards, he has received the Christian Gauss Award for Emerson and the Modern Language Association's J. Hubbell Award for lifetime contributions to American literature studies. He's lectured worldwide on American Transcendentalism. He's received lifetime service awards from both the Emerson Society and the Thoreau Society, and in 2007, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences just across the street. Now, Larry has not only been on Earth slightly longer than I have, he's been at Harvard longer too, but not by much. He arrived in 1990, and I arrived 4 years after him. Perhaps it reflects poorly on me that I didn't know him when I was an undergraduate in the 90s, even though he was the dean of undergraduate education. Or perhaps it reflects well, because it means I wasn't a discipline case. In any case, I wish I had known him, because even then I was harboring an interest, maybe even a passion, for Emerson and Thoreau. So ours is an acquaintance and a budding friendship, if I may be so bold, of more recent years, and one I'm deeply grateful for. I'm especially grateful for the counsel and support Larry has given Gosha, Russ, and me as we've launched this initiative. So before I invite Professor Buell to this podium, I want to acknowledge and thank my colleagues who have made this evening's event possible, as all events here possible. First and always, the wonderful team here at the CSWR with whom I have the pleasure of working every week. Gosha, Bashwar, I don't know if Bashwar's here, Lori, in the corner. Sarah, I know, has left for the day. Is Bashwar here? No. Okay. He's probably online. Yes. In any case, thank you so much, my beloved colleagues. I also want to thank my colleague Russ Powell, with whom, along with Gosha, I'm proud to lead this initiative. Russ, unfortunately, fell ill today and couldn't be with us. So here's how the evening will unfold. Professor Buell will speak for about 40 or 45 minutes, I'm told, and reflecting on the aims and the arguments of this latest book. And then we'll open it up for questions and comments from you all. My only request is that you please wait for a microphone before you ask your question or make your comment. That is for the benefit of those many who are joining us on Zoom. I will remind you of that if you forget, okay? But please be forgiving. Now, one last thing. Speaking of Thoreau's legacy, the Center is pleased to host a screening of the new PBS documentary on Thoreau, directed by Eric Ewers and Christopher Lauren Ewers and produced by Ken Burns and Don Henley. That's tomorrow. That's tomorrow from 2 to 4:30. It will include a screening of the second of the documentary's 3 episodes, remarks from the directors, and responses, I should say, from the directors, and we have one of the producers with us. Where are you, Susan? There you are, sorry, right in front of me. Susan will also be there tomorrow, so you can put all questions to her. We also have 3 wonderful scholars responding to the documentary, and then a panel discussion, which I will moderate. As I told you, the screening will take place tomorrow between 2 and 4:30, or from 2 to 4:30, at the Carpenter Center for Visual Arts on 24 Quincy Street. But I want you to immediately forget that address, because I'm told that the in-person event is fully booked and overbooked. But we'd love to have you join us online, where by the wonders of modern technology, I'm told you will be seamlessly ushered from watching the speakers to the documentary and back again. In other words, you won't have to watch the documentary through a camera. We'll see how seamless that is, but I'm hopeful. And one last thing, you will see Professor Buell featured in that documentary. Or I was just rewatching episode 1, and you're certainly in episode 1. I can't recall if you're in episode 2. Every episode. Okay. He's featured everywhere. I believe you're also in Emerson's bedroom, are you not? Where is he seated? He's in the Emerson house. Yeah.
Yeah, I am in the bedroom.
See? Kudos to me for clocking that. Yeah, I recognize the dresser. I'm pretty sure it's the bedroom. Okay. That's not weird. Okay. In any case, you're not here to listen to me make bad jokes. Thank you all so much for coming out, and thank you again, Professor Buell, for joining us. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thanks so much, Professor Stang, Charlie, for that very kind, excessively generous introduction, which, however, turned my head around when you were talking about me in the bedroom. Why was I taken up there? Who knows? Don't expect that I'm featured in this 3-part series. It's like 3 pop-up appearances at the different stages, but that's another matter. I'm delighted that you all ventured out at hunger hour to this event, and I've tried to keep my remarks relatively on the short side. We'll see if I succeed, because I really like dialogue. I'll welcome feedback from anyone who feels moved to speak. So this is going to be a, yes? Okay. Fine. Yes. Can you all hear? Okay. Well, this is going to be a 2-part talk. The first segment being a book talk overview with some reflections about that, and then fanning out to some broader, more panoramic ones about the course of the Transcendentalist movement then to now, and the future, we'll see. Thinking Disobediently, this book that some of you have in your hands was one of my shortest books, and yet none gave me greater pleasure to write. I loved writing it. It was a kind of COVID project that also helped me come to terms with the figure who, for me, was one of the most difficult nuts to crack among all those authors that I've studied closely over the years. With his guru, Emerson, I felt quite early on that I could follow the motions of his mind well, which is not a common reaction. More common is the sense that I could have been friends with Henry if I'd lived back then. And that's understandable because the figure presents himself more as a flesh and blood character than the more abstract recording consciousness of Ralph Waldo. Perhaps this says something about my own limits as a wonky professor, but never mind that. Anyhow, to get down to the book, For those of you who haven't read it, it's a 7-chapter structure, 4 on some of the key areas of accomplishment. I would say first Thoreau the writer, then Thoreau the natural scientist and forerunner of modern environmentalism, then the political Thoreau, the hero for modern civil resistors, and finally Thoreau the spiritual quester, and for some also the sage, the guru. 3 anchor chapters come first, one on Thoreau's lifeline and the myths that he built around it and were built around it by others. And one of my concerns there is to emphasize how strong the vein of automythography is in Thoreau's writing. That Thoreau has risen to something like folk hero status, unlike most other authors in U.S. history, except for Mark Twain, Hemingway. Maybe you'd mention Ben Franklin if you think of him as an author. Has to do a lot with that, the self-mythography of Thoreau's writing. Then comes a concentrated look at his most famous works, by far the most read, Walden and Civil Disobedience, that I argue are joined at the hip intrinsically, despite the opposite directions in which they pull, retreat to the woods and confrontation in public arena. And then a chapter on the Transcendentalist movement, featuring Emerson, that movement and this figure being Thoreau's incubator, mentor, and launching pad. So as I went through this sequence of 7, I was trying to solve some perennial mysteries about this figure that had long haunted me, and I'd pronounced judgment along the way, and yet I felt I hadn't fully come to terms with him. How to square the political Thoreau with the back to nature Thoreau, that was certainly one. How to square his poetic or aesthetic side with his increasingly empirical and scientistic side. And relatedly, how to parse his spiritual odyssey as he became increasingly post-religious, though not the philosophic materialist that some are claiming now. Then how the once worshipful disciple who lived his entire life in such close proximity to the master, Emerson, managed in time to rival and then outdistance him. It's a very striking phenomenon for me. I think almost unprecedented in world history that that should have happened. The disciple emerging from the master's shadow after having lived so closely together. And that takes me into the mysteries of mentorship and disciple refractoriness that dig deep into my own life experience as a teacher and what I think teaching and mentoring should be. And finally, I wanted the book to showcase, I wanted myself to be able to do justice in my analysis to how to read Thoreau's densely granular prose, in particular, the mixture of earnestness and humor that it discloses. And that's not easy to get the tone right, the nuances right. Even senior scholars screw up. Often the untutored reactions of undergraduate students come closer to the mark. There's a sort of convention of solemnity that overtakes the professoriate when we're unpacking our favorite subjects that sometimes keep us from being able to get to that level of mental suppleness in the writers that we treat. So some takeaways now. I was pretty happy with the way I resolved these and other questions. He says, perhaps naively, you may come back with me with questions after the fact that make me realize how much I screwed up. I felt, and I still do, that this is a short-term assessment of Thoreau's life, thought, art, the first one in 50 years, really, to absorb up-to-date scholarship that hopefully will stand for quite a while as the go-to first book. By the same token, its importance, I think, lies not in its delivery of a startling new thesis or theses about Thoreau, such as Thoreau was really trans or something of that kind. But in the depth and range of understanding of Thoreau as a thinker, writer, doer, and person. And I hope that if you spend a little time with the book, you'll feel the same way. I'll say a few things about the implications of the subtitle, Thinking Disobediently. That'll open up into some generalizations about Thoreau's legacy as I take it. I owe the subtitle to my handlers, to one of my editors. All books are collaborative ventures. They have often acknowledgement sections that run down the list, and mine was very sincerely meant, and this was one example. But I thought it fit just beautifully. Thinking Disobediently, the rubric. Emerson wrote in his funeral address to Thoreau, his first instinct upon hearing a proposition was to controvert it. Indeed, Emerson goes on and says, this is a habit rather chilling to the social affections. And he knew Thoreau bit the hand that fed him often. So you see this in Thoreau's asperity towards entrenched religious orthodoxy versus the inner moral compass that he's always urging us to steer by, in his distrust for formal learning as against experiential, his bristling at deference to social pedigree, his fury against institutionalized slavery, which was getting more aggressive in his lifetime, the widening gap between rich and poor in the early industrial era, runaway capitalism wasting the natural environment, and his aversion to the then still new era of machine politics. During his lifetime, he endured a series of lousy presidents, I mean really terrible presidents. He didn't live to recognize Lincoln's turn towards abolitionism, unfortunately, but that was life, or rather not life, termination. Does that list sound familiar? It should. And a takeaway here is that Thoreau's core ideas are not going to go out of fashion anytime soon, most certainly not in the age of Trump. And that, I think, is one of the key themes in the three-part Ken Burns series, of which you'll see, if you tune in, part 2 unveiled tomorrow. The mass of men live lives of quiet desperation. That's how we live now. That's one of the parting shots in part 3 of the Burns series on Thoreau. So true, alas. And to get more specific, these specific lines of influence that we see emanating from Thoreau are almost certainly bound to persist. The spiritual seeker, who was an early example of spiritual, not religious, the phrase we often hear today in liberal religious circles. The icon of do-it-yourself voluntary simplicity with the self-built cabin as a defining image that we see attempted replications of worldwide, every continent. The seminal framer of civil disobedience theory, the pioneer ecologist and patron saint of modern environmentalism, and the catalyst of U.S. literary emergence. It used to be called the American Renaissance, that explosive era, and especially for Thoreau, the rich tradition of American first-person writing, autobiography, memoir, seminal there, and even more so in the also very rich tradition of the modern nature essay, of which Thoreau is a kind of founder. Thoreau's always going to be controversial, and always to some acutely irritating, just as back then he was. The person who insisted on nibbling his asparagus at the wrong end. This is Oliver Wendell Holmes, one of Emerson's cronies. I sometimes ask my students, who would you rather room with, Emerson or Thoreau? And they want to say Thoreau, and then they think twice, and they think, well, maybe not. One lesson there, I think, is heretics are easier to take from a distance than up close sometimes. And we could admire Thoreau maybe better now than in his own time. And maybe that's one of the reasons why his reputation blossomed after his death. So maybe the crotchety ones among us can take heart for that. So now I'm going to segue from a book talk mode to some macro reflections on transcendentalism from then to now. But I will loop back to Thoreau and a particular chapter of my book towards the end. For both the original movement in the 30s and 40s, the 1830s and 40s, and for its later legacies, three themes are especially central. Those of you who have studied the movement will not be surprised at the next couple of paragraphs, but they bear repetition, and this is an audience that goes way beyond specialists. First and foremost theme, the inherent divinity of the human, a reinvention of the Reformation idea of the individual's potential connectedness with the divine, but stripped of its residues of original sin, predestination, and so forth, and democratized to apply to all persons, not just an elect. And with this same push against and beyond the limits of the Unitarian liberal rationalism within which Transcendentalism took form, came also an increasing openness to world religions other than Christianity, and freelance spiritual questing as legitimate paths to enlightenment, the truth. Second theme, relatedly, iconoclastic skepticism towards the whole social status quo, meaning, for instance, a strong tilt to women's rights, abolitionism, child-centered pedagogy, and utopian living experiments from solo affairs like the Walden Sojourn to collective remake the world ventures like Brook Farm, to Margaret Fuller's partisanship in the Italian Revolution of 1848. Some of this ferment was more armchair than activist, and all of it was more or less constrained by the status of most of the players as educated white men and women of pedigreed ancestry. But still, there's a strong reformist edge to their thinking across the board. And third, a marked proclivity for creative expression, particularly the written and spoken word as a vehicle for advocacy. Poetry being most prized in theory, but in practice, especially intellectual prose, lecture, essay, memoir, sermon, and also structured dialogue in the so-called conversations of Fuller and Bronson Alcott. And indeed, for most, if not all, of the players, their words have proved much mightier than their acts. If Thoreau had never written Civil Disobedience, who would remember his night in jail? That's a rhetorical question. All three emphases persisted after the movement faded, not so much as a package, however, but as legacies of particular figures, such as Theodore Parker's influence on the social gospel movement, Thoreau's on the birth of environmentalism and civil disobedience of Tolstoy, Gandhi, and King, Emerson on the pragmatism of William James and John Dewey, and on the poetry of Whitman, Dickinson, and Frost, Fuller on women's rights advocacy. Those are salient examples. What revitalized the image of a coherent movement in the 1900s, initially more in academia than in broader public consciousness, was the rise of the interrelated fields of American literature, religion, and intellectual history as areas of study, and the effect, such as it was, of generations of teachers like me propagating to generations of students like me and some of you, the conception of Transcendentalism as a defining episode in the history of the American mind. But as the century wore on, the 20th century wore on, a counter trend begins to emerge that I think is quite striking. Here I turn to Google Ngram graphs, very profound research tools. An Ngram graph of the frequency of usage of the word transcendentalism shows a dramatic drop from 1880 to about 1930. That is, from about Emerson's death until the moment when American literature, religion, and intellectual history and American studies begin to crystallize as academic programs and research areas. But then a first slow, then faster rise to a peak around 1980, and a further rise into the 2000s, so that today Transcendentalism is cited as often as it was at its high point around the death of Ralph Waldo, at least in the universe of Google books in English. For American Transcendentalism, the graph is far more dramatic. Very little mention until 1930. It's like it didn't exist. And then a jaggedy climb to a peak in this century. And for Transcendental, a more dramatic ascent explosion still. So what's going on? Why should this be? Of course, the sheer proliferation of scholarship on Transcendentalism since the 1930s helps to explain. But that's not the whole story, for sure. Because in the 40 years or so since the first and lower peak, Transcendentalism as a prestige research field, an inevitable teaching topic, has shrunk a lot. So, and yet concurrently has risen a burgeoning grassroots stake in what Transcendentalism is, was, might, and should be. Judging from a random walk through the blogosphere, for some, Transcendentalism now seems indistinguishable from transcendental meditation. For others, serious hikers or surfers or neo-paganists are Transcendentalism's rightful legatees. For still others, the lyrics of John Lennon and Beyonce, I kid you not. For still others, like the so-called modern Transcendentalist movement, the dismantling of all institutions of systemic racial, social, and environmental injustice. So Transcendentalism in the 21st century presents itself as both a research and teaching area, diminished, but also as a potent centrifuge, reaching out its tentacles in all sorts of directions. The partakers in this centrifuge do seem to want, more often than not, to align themselves, at least nominally, with the original movement, conjuring up the authority of Emerson and Thoreau in particular, sometimes also Fuller, and now and then scholarly figures as well, especially leading biographers like Robert Richardson, Laura Walls, and Megan Marshall. So there's definitely a synergy as well as a tension between the domains of top-down and grassroots percolation here around the vision of transcendentalism and what it was. I think a handy microcosm of what's going on, the scene I'm describing, might be the round-the-year programs of the Thoreau Alliance and the Thoreau Society's annual gathering in July, which, unlike many other author societies, with rare exceptions like the Jane Austen Society, are a concourse of scholars and real people, enthusiasts of diverse passions with no intention to write articles and books. It was not always so. The Thoreau Society started in the early 40s, like most author societies, as a tiny group of mostly academics. But since then, it has mushroomed, especially during the last several decades, into a showcase example of the convergence between scholarly academe and grassroots enthusiasts. So, sorry about this. Pages stick. And that, too, is one of the themes in the three-part Burns documentary on Thoreau just out this week. Thoreau is a touchstone figure for much wider public worldwide than just the tribe of Thoreau scholars. Other such like examples in the afterlife of Transcendentalism come to mind as well. Why was it that the year 1910 for the American Unitarian Association was all about the centennial of Theodore Parker's birth? Whereas in 2010, the UUA convention refocused on the bicentennial of Margaret Fuller, born the same year. Obviously because intellectual and public culture had changed seismically in tandem in their upward evaluation, not just of Fuller vis-a-vis Parker, but the significance of women's contributions to history across the board. In turn-of-the-century transcendentalism studies, Phyllis Cole, Megan Marshall, Sandra Petrilunas, Charles Capper, Helen Deese, many others have reframed the whole arc of the movement from origins to last acts in very major formative ways. And that accomplishment is especially striking both for its cogency and for its belatedness, let me add. Even though American Transcendentalism was rightly seen to be an unusually gender-inclusive movement in its own day, that historical reality was seriously underrepresented in what passed for cutting-edge research until the late 1900s, with the top-notch work ironically coming well after the first burst of feminist revisionism in literary, historical, and religious studies. What I've called belatedness was surely the upshot of a combination of the inertial effect of tone deafness among the androcentric professoriate that first canonized the movement for the academy, followed by increasingly unstoppable interest in women as historical actors, both in academia and beyond. So now I'm going to return finally to Thoreau in particular. Especially notable, even more than the recent work on the significance of the women around Thoreau, is the interdependence since the turn of the century of academic and popular investment in the political Thoreau and the green Thoreau, about which I'd be glad to say more in the QA. But for now, I want instead to focus on another area with which I wrestled in the last chapter of my book. And I'm still wrestling with it. And the Center for the Study of World Religion seems the right place to confess it. And that's the topic of Thoreau's spiritual walk, which my book lays out as a series of constellation of different avatars shifting over time and partly conflicting, partly converging. I was struck in other versions of dialogues and book talks that I've given about this book, how much that chapter comes out, how much the Matters of Faith chapter folks want to talk about. When composing it, I didn't fully grasp the extent of the upsurge taking place around me in the framing and reframing of Thoreau in religiocentric terms, even though I had been present at the creation of several of those books, which began in the OOs with Alan Hodder's Thoreau's Ecstatic Witness, Rebecca Gould's At Home in Nature, Modern Homesteading as Spiritual Practice, and Malcolm Young's Thoreau's Spiritual Journal. And it's accelerated in this very decade with, for instance, Alda Balthrop Lewis's Thoreau's Religion, Barry Andrews's The Gospel According to This Moment, Richard Higgins's Thoreau's God, and Lydia Wilsky's Ciolo's Wildness, Henry Thoreau and the Making of an American Theology. Thoreau as a theologian? Really? What strikes me about this upsurge of interest isn't the contention that Thoreau had a spiritual side, nor the disparity with which it's been mapped, which ranges from theistic to pantheistic, quietist to activist. Both the salience and the elusiveness are clear enough from the biographical record. What bemuses me is rather the why now question. Why this mini boom in Thoreau's studies under the sign of religion should be happening concurrently with what seemed to be sharply opposing takes, at least as consequential, such as increasing claims for his accomplishments as an empirical scientist. But if it's true, as the great sociologist of religion, Robert Wuthnow, contends, that seekers' spirituality is now the persuasion of a plurality, if not a majority, of Americans across the board, then the spike makes sense. When the firewall between church religion and the Church of the Woods breaks down, not just in liberal Protestantism, but across the board, then what could be more natural, pardon the pun, than that the heretical Thoreau should be brought within the fold? So with that, I close. I hope leading to some reactions and questions and furtherance from this group. And thank you very much for listening.
CSWR.HDS.Harvard.edu. Copyright 2026. The President and Fellows of Harvard College.